The brightest rooms don't always hide the darkest secrets. Sometimes they reveal the one person brave enough to stand beneath the light. The first thing I noticed wasn't the music. It was the chandeliers. Hundreds of crystal pieces hung above the ballroom like frozen stars, catching the warm golden light and scattering it across polished marble floors until the entire room shimmered as if the building itself had learned how to breathe. I stood perfectly still for a moment, balancing a silver tray against my hip while guests in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns drifted past me without ever really seeing me. To them, I was simply another waitress in a black uniform, another quiet face making sure champagne glasses never stayed empty for long. At 25, I had learned that invisible people heard everything. Working private events across Manhattan paid better than coffee shops or diners, and every extra dollar brought me closer to finishing my degree in art restoration. Most nights, I focused on keeping my head down, collecting my tips, and imagining a future filled with old paintings instead of expensive strangers. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Outside, rain tapped softly against the towering windows of the Grand Hawthorne Hotel, turning the city lights into shimmering watercolor streaks. Inside, a string quartet played near the marble staircase while conversations floated through the ballroom like expensive perfume. Investors discussed acquisitions. Politicians exchanged careful smiles. Philanthropists raised crystal glasses to causes they barely remembered by dessert. It was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful. Elegant. Quiet. Untouchable. My supervisor leaned close as I passed the service station. Table 14 needs another bottle. And smile, Claire. These people pay for perfection. I smiled because smiling cost nothing. As I crossed the ballroom, I caught my reflection in one of the enormous gilded mirrors stretching from floor to ceiling. My blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a simple black ribbon. My pale skin looked almost luminous beneath the chandeliers, though exhaustion still lingered beneath my blue eyes after studying until nearly 2 a.m. I reminded myself that this shift alone would cover next month's textbooks. That thought made carrying another tray feel lighter. Near the far end of the ballroom stood a set of ornate double doors leading to a private gallery reserved for the evening's most influential guests. Staff members weren't supposed to linger there. Deliver the drinks. Walk away. Those were the rules. I repeated them silently as I approached with a fresh bottle of sparkling water balanced beside crystal glasses. The doors opened just enough for 2 men in tailored suits to step inside. One of them glanced over his shoulder before quietly pulling the door almost closed again. Almost. Through the narrow opening, I heard only fragments. A shipment. Midnight. Documents that could never reach the authorities. Their voices remained calm, almost casual, which somehow made every word feel heavier. My feet stopped before my mind realized they had. Then someone behind me called another server's name. I turned too quickly. The edge of my tray brushed against a marble pedestal supporting an enormous arrangement of white orchids. One crystal flute trembled. Another tipped sideways. Time seemed to slow as brilliant glass slipped toward the polished floor beneath the endless glow of the chandeliers. The crystal flute struck the marble floor with a sharp, delicate crack that echoed through the ballroom far louder than it should have. Every nearby conversation dissolved into silence. The violinist stopped in the middle of a note. My heartbeat seemed to replace the music as hundreds of eyes drifted toward me. I stared at the scattered pieces sparkling beneath the golden light, unable to breathe. I had dropped glasses before. Every server had. But somehow this felt different, as though the room itself had been waiting for something to interrupt its perfect performance. I lowered myself carefully, whispering, "I am so sorry," even though no one had asked for an apology yet. My fingers reached toward the broken crystal before I remembered the safety training and quickly pulled my hand back. Tiny reflections danced across the polished marble, turning every shattered piece into another fragment of the chandeliers above. The silence stretched another second. Then I noticed it. It was not the guests who held their breath. It was the security staff. Their attention had shifted away from me toward the grand entrance. The massive doors opened without a sound, No announcement followed. No fanfare. Yet the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations did not resume. Instead, people stepped aside almost instinctively, creating a path before anyone had spoken a single word. A tall man entered wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit beneath a long black overcoat, still carrying faint droplets of rain across the shoulders. He did not rush. He did not appear interested in commanding attention. Somehow, attention belonged to him anyway. His dark hair was neatly brushed back, revealing calm gray eyes that moved across the ballroom with quiet precision. He acknowledged no one immediately, though several guests greeted him with respectful nods. Others lowered their voices the moment he passed. I had worked enough luxury events to recognize influence. Wealth usually announced itself loudly. Power rarely needed introductions. The hotel manager appeared beside him within seconds, smiling far more nervously than I had ever seen. They exchanged only a few quiet words before the manager gestured toward the ballroom. The man simply nodded. That was all. No dramatic entrance. No unnecessary confidence. Just complete certainty that every step belonged exactly where he placed it. I should have returned to work. Instead, I remained kneeling beside the broken glasses longer than necessary, unable to explain why I kept watching him. Something about his expression refused to match the stories whispered by other employees before the gala. They had described Adrian Romano as intimidating, impossible to read, the kind of businessman whose schedule required private security and absolute discretion. None of them had mentioned how quietly he carried himself. His gaze continued across the room until it stopped. On me. Not on the broken crystal. Not on the embarrassed waitress kneeling on the marble floor. On me. It lasted only a few seconds, yet I felt strangely exposed, as though he had noticed every exhausted morning, every overdue tuition bill, every dream I kept folded inside myself like old letters. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward the nearly closed gallery doors where I had accidentally overheard the conversation only moments earlier. His expression did not change, but I saw the smallest pause in his stride. He looked back at me once more before continuing forward. One of the security men quietly approached. I expected to be escorted out for disrupting the event. Instead, he leaned down just enough that only I could hear him. Miss Bennet, he said calmly, somehow already knowing my name, Mr. Romano would appreciate a few minutes of your time after the gala concludes. There is nothing to fear. He simply wishes to speak with you. My stomach tightened. I had never met Adrian Romano before that evening. Yet somehow I already knew my night was not ending when everyone else went home. The remaining hours of the gala passed in a blur of polished silver trays, quiet apologies, and practiced smiles that felt heavier each time I forced one onto my face. I kept replaying the security guard's words in my mind. Mr. Romano would appreciate a few minutes of your time. It sounded polite enough, yet something about it refused to leave me alone. Every now and then I caught sight of Adrian across the ballroom. He spoke with senators, museum directors, business executives, and donors whose names appeared on skyscrapers and university buildings. He never lingered. He never laughed too loudly. He listened far more than he spoke, and somehow everyone else adjusted their pace to match his. It was nearly midnight when the last guests began leaving beneath the covered entrance, their chauffeurs waiting outside as the rain softened into a light mist. The string quartet packed away their instruments while hotel staff quietly cleared empty glasses from white linen tables. My feet ached from 10 hours of standing, and all I wanted was the subway ride back to my tiny apartment in Queens. I slipped into the service hallway, untied my apron, and reached for my coat hanging inside the employee locker room. Before I could put it on, another hotel employee approached me. Miss Bennet, she asked gently. Mr. Romano is waiting in the East Library. My stomach tightened again. Can I decline? I asked before thinking. She offered an apologetic smile. That is entirely your decision. She hesitated for only a second. But I think he would appreciate the opportunity to explain why he asked. Explain what? I had no answers, only questions. After taking one slow breath, I followed the quiet corridor leading toward the hotel's private library. Unlike the ballroom, this room felt warm and intimate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves framed dark walnut walls. A fireplace glowed softly despite the mild spring weather outside. Antique lamps cast pools of amber light across Persian rugs, replacing the dazzling brilliance of the chandeliers with something calmer. Adrian stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. His overcoat rested across the back of a leather chair. One hand loosely held a porcelain espresso cup that had long since stopped steaming. He looked toward the rain outside until he heard the door close behind me. Then he turned. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was lower than I expected, steady without sounding rehearsed. "Thank you for staying. I was told you wished to speak with me." My voice sounded smaller than I intended. "Yes." He gestured toward a chair across from him. "Please." I remained standing. "I would rather stand, if that is all right." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest suggestion of a smile. "That is perfectly all right." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It simply felt deliberate. Adrian studied me for a brief moment before asking, "How long have you worked these events?" "Almost 2 years." "Do you enjoy them?" The question surprised me. "Not particularly. But they help pay my tuition." He nodded once, as though confirming something only he understood. Then his expression became thoughtful again. "Earlier tonight," he said calmly, "you were near the gallery doors." My heartbeat quickened. "I was serving water." "I believe that." His gray eyes never left mine. "Did you hear anything while you were there?" I could have lied. Every instinct told me to deny everything. Instead, I answered carefully. "Only a few words." They did not make much sense. Adrian remained silent long enough that I wondered whether he believed me. Finally, he placed the untouched espresso cup onto the table. "Good," he said quietly. "Because from this moment forward, I would strongly prefer that you never walk home alone." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "Someone else may assume you heard far more than you actually did." His tone never changed. "I have no intention of controlling your life, Miss Bennet. But until I know you are safe, I would like to make certain you are not left unprotected." I stared at him, completely unable to decide whether I had just been warned, rescued, or invited into a story I never intended to become part of. I left the library with more questions than answers. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks glistening beneath rows of streetlights that stretched toward the horizon like reflections on black glass. Parked beside the hotel entrance was a dark sedan I had not noticed earlier. One of the men from Adrian Romano's security team opened the rear door before I could protest. "Mr. Romano asked us to drive you home, Miss Bennet." I tightened my grip on the strap of my worn canvas bag. "That is not necessary. I always take the subway." The man did not argue. He simply replied, "He expected you might say that." Before I could respond, Adrian stepped through the revolving doors, his coat folded neatly over one arm. He looked less like the powerful figure who had quietly commanded an entire ballroom and more like someone finishing an unusually long day. "You are free to refuse," he said as he approached. "No one here will stop you." I studied his expression, searching for pressure, expectation, or hidden motives. I found none. "Then why insist?" I asked. He glanced briefly toward the nearly empty street before answering. "Because caution is sometimes mistaken for inconvenience until it becomes necessary." His words lingered longer than I expected. After several quiet seconds, I nodded once and climbed into the car. The ride across Manhattan was almost completely silent. The city outside looked different from behind the tinted windows. Yellow taxis drifted through rain-soaked intersections. Late-night diners still glowed with warm neon lights. Couples hurried beneath shared umbrellas while delivery bicycles disappeared into narrow side streets. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to simply watch the city without rushing somewhere. Adrian sat across from me, reading messages on a tablet without interrupting the silence. He never attempted small talk. Somehow that made the space feel less uncomfortable. As we crossed the Queensboro Bridge, he finally looked up. "You restore paintings," he said. I blinked. "I study art restoration." "What drew you to it?" No one had asked me that in years. Most people only wanted to know whether the degree would pay well. "Old paintings survive because someone decides they are worth saving," I answered quietly. I always liked that idea. He considered my words before nodding once. "An unusual answer." "Most people think so. Most people only value things that are new." He looked back out the window. "History often deserves better." His answer surprised me almost as much as the question had. 20 minutes later the sedan turned onto my street. Compared to the marble entrance of the Grand Hawthorne Hotel, my apartment building looked painfully ordinary. Faded brick. Flickering hallway lights. Flower boxes maintained by retired neighbors who still believed every building deserved a little color. The driver stopped at the curb. I reached for the door handle before turning back toward Adrian. "Thank you for the ride." "You are welcome, Miss Bennett." I hesitated. "Will this happen every night now?" Another faint smile appeared. "Only until I know you are no longer being noticed by the wrong people." I frowned. "You keep saying things like that without explaining them." Sometimes explanations create more danger than silence. It was not the answer I wanted. It was probably the only one he intended to give. I stepped onto the sidewalk and watched the sedan disappear around the corner. By the time I reached my apartment on the 3rd floor, exhaustion had finally caught up with me. I dropped my keys into a ceramic bowl near the door and noticed something resting against the inside of the welcome mat. It was a plain white envelope with my name written neatly across the front. No postage. No return address. My heartbeat slowed as I carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing only one sentence typed in black ink. "We know what you heard." I read the sentence 3 times before I realized I had stopped breathing. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers, though I could not tell whether it was from the cool air drifting through my apartment window or from my own hands refusing to stay steady. "We know what you heard." Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Just 7 words that somehow filled the entire room. I checked the hallway through the peephole. Empty. The old fluorescent light buzzed faintly above the worn carpet, and somewhere downstairs Mrs. Henderson's television played a late-night game show loud enough to leak through the walls. Everything looked painfully ordinary. That was almost worse. I locked the deadbolt, then checked it a second time before placing the note on my tiny kitchen table. My apartment measured barely 500 square feet. A faded blue couch sat beneath the only window. Shelves filled with art history textbooks lined one wall beside jars of tiny restoration brushes I had saved for months to buy. Usually this space felt safe. Tonight it felt exposed. Sleep never came. Every sound from the hallway made me glance toward the door. Every pair of headlights passing outside painted moving shadows across the ceiling. By sunrise I had convinced myself of 2 completely opposite ideas. Either someone wanted to frighten me, or someone wanted to warn me. I just could not decide which possibility was worse. The following morning I folded the note into my backpack before catching the subway to Columbia University. Normally I spent hours in the restoration studio cleaning centuries-old varnish from damaged paintings beneath bright laboratory lights. Today I could not focus on anything. My instructor asked whether I was feeling well after noticing I had cleaned the same corner of a canvas for nearly 20 minutes. I smiled and blamed lack of sleep. It was easier than explaining the truth I barely understood myself. Around noon my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Almost. "Miss Bennett," a calm voice said after I answered. I recognized it immediately. Adrian's head of security. Good afternoon. My pulse quickened. How did you get my number? Mr. Romano asked me to make certain you arrived safely at school. I looked around the studio, suddenly aware of every window. You have been watching me? Observing your surroundings, he corrected politely. There is a difference. I wanted to argue. Instead, I reached into my backpack and unfolded the note beneath the work table. Someone left this at my apartment last night. Silence answered for several seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice had grown more serious. Please do not throw it away. Why? Because Mr. Romano was afraid something like this might happen. My stomach tightened. So he was right. He rarely enjoys being right about these situations. Before I could ask another question, he added, would you be willing to meet him after your classes today? I stared at the note again. Yesterday I would have refused without hesitation. Today the decision felt different. Whoever had slipped that envelope beneath my door already knew where I lived. They had reached me before I even understood I was part of someone else's story. I closed my eyes for a brief moment before answering. Tell him I will come. As I slipped the folded paper back into my bag, I noticed a figure across the street standing beside a newspaper stand. The man wore an ordinary gray jacket and held a cup of coffee, but the moment our eyes met, he quietly turned away and disappeared into the afternoon crowd before I could convince myself it had been nothing more than coincidence. The black sedan was waiting outside the university when my last class ended, parked beneath a row of maple trees whose fresh spring leaves fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze. Students hurried past carrying backpacks and coffee cups, laughing about weekend plans while I stood on the sidewalk holding a future that suddenly felt uncertain. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door with the same quiet professionalism I had seen the night before. This time I climbed inside without arguing. Adrian was already there, seated across from me with a slim folder resting on his lap. He looked up as the car pulled away from campus. Thank you for coming, he said. I reached into my backpack and handed him the folded note. He studied it for only a few seconds before passing it to the man seated beside the driver. Have this examined, he said calmly. No raised voice. No visible frustration. Just another quiet instruction. The envelope disappeared from sight. I folded my arms. You expected this. Adrian met my eyes. I hoped I was wrong. You keep telling me pieces of the story instead of the whole thing. He remained silent until the sedan stopped at a red light overlooking the East River. Sunlight reflected across the water in thousands of bright flashes, making the city seem almost peaceful. The people speaking inside the gallery were discussing matters they believed no one else could hear, he said at last. You were never supposed to be near those doors. I barely heard anything. They do not know that. I looked out the window. And now they think I know everything. Yes. The honesty in his answer unsettled me more than any dramatic warning could have. So what happens now? He took a slow breath before answering. Your apartment is no longer a place I consider secure. I turned back toward him immediately. I am not leaving my home because of one anonymous note. I understand. His voice remained remarkably patient. If our positions were reversed, I might say exactly the same thing. Then stop asking me. I am not asking. He paused just long enough for me to notice the difference. I am offering you another option. The sedan turned through tall iron gates that opened onto a quiet estate overlooking the river. Instead of the extravagant mansion I had imagined, the property resembled a historic stone residence surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and towering oak trees. Flowering dogwoods lined the winding driveway, their white blossoms moving softly in the breeze. It felt less like the headquarters of a feared businessman and more like an old family home preserved through generations. Inside, polished wood floors reflected warm afternoon light pouring through oversized windows. Shelves filled with books stretched from floor to ceiling. Framed paintings hung throughout the hallways, many of them American landscapes and Italian Renaissance reproductions restored with extraordinary care. Without thinking, I stepped closer to examine one canvas. The craquelure was preserved instead of hidden, I whispered. Adrian stopped beside me. You noticed. Most people would have over-restored it. He nodded slightly. My grandmother believed every scar earned honestly deserved to remain visible. I looked at him with genuine surprise. She collected art? She restored it. For the first time since we had met, the conversation no longer revolved around fear or unanswered questions. It revolved around something familiar. Something human. Then his security director quietly entered the room carrying the envelope I had received the night before inside a clear evidence sleeve. Sir, he said respectfully, there is something else you should see. Adrian's expression became serious again as he accepted the envelope, turned it over, and discovered a small embossed symbol pressed almost invisibly into the back flap, a symbol that made him grow completely still. Adrian stared at the tiny embossed symbol for several long seconds before carefully placing the envelope back inside the clear sleeve. It was the first time I had seen any crack in his calm expression. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes from discovering an old problem has quietly returned. What is it? I asked. His security director looked toward him, silently waiting for permission. Adrian gave the smallest nod. Leave us. The man disappeared without another word, closing the library door softly behind him. I folded my arms. I think I deserve an explanation now. Adrian rested both hands against the edge of the oak table before looking directly at me. You do. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with obvious care. The mark on that envelope belongs to an organization that prefers influence over attention. They rarely make mistakes, and they rarely forget witnesses. I am not a witness, I replied immediately. I heard a few random sentences that barely made sense. You know that. They do not. Frustration rose inside me before I could stop it. Then tell them they are wrong. His expression softened just enough to reveal genuine regret. People like that do not schedule conversations. I turned away and walked toward the nearest window. The gardens outside stretched peacefully toward the river where sailboats drifted beneath the afternoon sun. Birds landed among rows of blooming tulips. Nothing about the view matched the conversation happening inside the room. I cannot stay here, I said quietly. My classes start at 8 every morning. I have exams next month. I have a job. I have a real life that existed before one charity gala. I know. Do you? I faced him again. Because everyone around you keeps deciding what is best for me without asking what I actually want. The silence between us grew heavier than before. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply listened. Finally he spoke. Then tell me what you want. The question caught me completely off guard. I want to finish school. My answer came instantly. I want to restore paintings in a museum where the most exciting part of my day is arguing about varnish formulas. I want to pay my own rent without wondering whether someone is following me home. I want my ordinary life back. Adrian nodded once. Reasonable goals. I laughed once, though there was no humor in it. They sound impossible when you say them. Only because they have become more complicated. I looked at him carefully. You are used to solving everyone's problems. No. His answer came quietly. I am used to carrying responsibility when circumstances place it in front of me. There is a difference? A very important one. He walked toward the bookshelf where an unfinished landscape rested on an easel. The colors had faded with age, but the horizon remained remarkably bright. This painting belonged to my grandmother, he said. When I was a boy, I asked why she spent months repairing works created by strangers. She told me something I never forgot. His fingers lightly touched the frame. If something valuable is damaged because it crossed your path, pretending it is not your responsibility does not erase the damage. I followed his gaze to the painting before quietly answering, I am not a painting that needs to be repaired. A faint smile appeared on his face. No. He looked back at me. You are the restorer. Before I could respond, the library door opened again. The security director returned holding a tablet instead of the envelope. Sir, he said calmly, our team reviewed the university security cameras from this afternoon. He turned the screen toward us. There, standing across the street exactly where I had seen him, was the man in the gray jacket. He was not watching the campus entrance. He was watching me. And according to the timestamp in the corner of the video, he had arrived nearly 2 hours before my class had ended. I could not stop staring at the image on the tablet. The man looked completely ordinary. Average height. Gray jacket. Baseball cap pulled low enough to disappear into any crowd. If I had passed him on the sidewalk 100 times, I would never have remembered his face. Somehow that made the picture even more unsettling. Adrian studied the screen without saying a word. Finally, he handed the tablet back to his security director. Continue monitoring. Do not approach him unless absolutely necessary. The man nodded once and quietly left the room again. I looked at Adrian with disbelief. That is all? He met my eyes. That is enough for now. Someone waited outside my university for almost 2 hours. Yes. And you are not sending anyone after him? Adrian walked toward the window overlooking the gardens. If someone wants to be seen, there is usually a reason. I frowned. You think he wanted us to notice him? Perhaps. He folded his hands behind his back. Or perhaps someone wanted us looking at him instead of somewhere else. I had entered the room expecting dramatic answers. Instead, I found careful patience. Every conclusion seemed to require another question. Every answer revealed another layer I had never considered. Before I could speak again, a gentle knock sounded at the library door. An elderly woman wearing a navy cardigan smiled warmly as she stepped inside carrying a silver tea tray. I hope I am not interrupting. Adrian's expression changed immediately. The tension that had remained around his eyes softened almost instantly. Never, Mrs. Eleanor. He walked forward and took the tray from her himself before she could struggle with its weight. You should have asked someone to carry this. She laughed quietly. You have been telling me that for 10 years. He smiled back, a genuine smile that looked completely different from the restrained expressions I had seen until now. And one day you might listen. Mrs. Eleanor turned toward me with kind blue eyes. You must be Claire. I blinked. Yes, ma'am. It is lovely to finally meet you. Finally. The word lingered in my thoughts. She arranged porcelain cups on the coffee table before noticing my puzzled expression. Do not worry, she said gently. He only speaks about people when they matter. Adrian looked mildly embarrassed, which somehow seemed impossible only minutes earlier. Mrs. Eleanor has worked with my family since before I was born, he explained. Worked, she interrupted with a playful smile. Raised is probably the better word. I watched as Adrian poured her tea before preparing his own. He waited until she sat comfortably before taking his own seat. It was a simple gesture, but it carried quiet respect that could not be performed for appearance alone. This was habit. This was character. While we talked, another house employee entered carrying fresh flowers for the library. Adrian stood to help him move a heavy ceramic vase closer to the sunlight. He thanked him by name before returning to the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. No one in the house seemed afraid of him. They respected him, certainly, but there was warmth beneath that respect. It challenged every assumption I had made after hearing whispers about the mysterious Adrian Romano. When Mrs. Eleanor excused herself, she paused beside me. You look tired, dear. I smiled politely. It has been a long couple of days. She gently touched my shoulder. Then stay for dinner before making any decisions. No one thinks clearly on an empty stomach. After she left, I turned toward Adrian. They care about you. He looked toward the closed door for a moment before answering. I try to earn that every day. His words settled quietly between us. For the first time since the gala, I stopped seeing only the powerful man everyone whispered about. I began seeing the person hidden beneath the reputation. Then Adrian's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth disappeared from his face. He looked directly at me. "Claire," he said calmly, "someone just attempted to enter your apartment using a copied key." The words settled over the room with a quiet weight that made everything else disappear. I stared at Adrian, waiting for him to tell me there had been some mistake. He never did. Instead, he placed his phone on the table and turned the screen toward me. A live security feed showed the entrance to my apartment building. 2 uniformed officers stood inside the hallway speaking with the property manager while another resident watched nervously from the stairwell. There were no flashing lights. No chaos. Just ordinary people trying to understand something that suddenly no longer felt ordinary. "How do you have cameras there?" I asked. Adrian shook his head. "I do not. One of my security consultants contacted the building manager after you received the note. They agreed to place temporary monitoring in the hallway this afternoon." I looked at him in disbelief. "Without telling me?" "Yes." His honesty remained almost frustrating. "You had every right to know. I chose caution over permission, and I accept that you may disagree with the decision." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he had crossed a line. But another thought reached me first. If those cameras had not been installed, no one would have known someone had tried to enter my apartment. I lowered my eyes. "Did they get inside?" "No." Relief escaped me before I could stop it. Adrian continued carefully. "The copied key failed because the building manager changed your lock cylinder this afternoon." "You changed my locks?" "No. I recommended that he offer the service." He agreed. I let out a slow breath and leaned back into the chair. Every ordinary piece of my life seemed to be disappearing one careful decision at a time. Adrian studied me quietly before speaking again. "Claire, I know this feels overwhelming. That is one way to describe it." He nodded. "Then allow me to explain something I should have explained sooner." He reached toward a nearby cabinet and removed an old leather portfolio. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs of charity events, museum fundraisers, scholarship ceremonies, and community restoration projects dating back more than 20 years. None of them looked anything like the stories whispered about him. My family foundation finances restoration programs, medical clinics, youth scholarships, and neighborhood preservation grants. He slid one photograph toward me. It showed children painting murals on the walls of a community center. Adrian stood in the background wearing jeans instead of a tailored suit, helping a little boy clean blue paint from his hands. "Why have I never heard about this?" I asked softly. "Because the projects matter more than publicity." I continued turning the pages. Art museums. Historic churches. Public libraries. Free after-school programs. My finger stopped on a familiar image. It was the restoration laboratory at Columbia University. "Wait." I looked up at him. "This is my department." Adrian nodded. "The equipment was donated 3 years ago." "By your foundation?" "Yes." I remembered the plaque mounted quietly beside the laboratory entrance. Romano Cultural Preservation Initiative. I had walked past it hundreds of times without giving it another thought. Somehow I had never connected the name. I closed the portfolio carefully. "You protect paintings," I said. "Historic buildings. Students. Neighborhoods." Adrian smiled faintly. "Whenever possible." "Then why does everyone only talk about your power?" His expression grew thoughtful. "Because quiet work rarely becomes interesting conversation." The room fell silent again until Mrs. Eleanor returned carrying dinner. Homemade vegetable soup, warm bread, roasted chicken, and fresh herbs filled the library with comforting aromas that reminded me more of family holidays than elegant estates. As she placed another bowl before me, she smiled knowingly. Sometimes people arrive here believing they have stepped into the wrong story. Before I could answer, the security director entered once more, this time carrying a small evidence bag. Inside was a brass key with my apartment number engraved on it. "Sir," he said calmly, "this was recovered outside the building entrance. It is not the original key. Someone had a duplicate made only 2 days ago." I stared at the duplicate key resting inside the evidence bag, unable to understand how a simple piece of brass could make my entire life feel unfamiliar. 2 days ago, I had been worrying about tuition payments and final projects. Now strangers knew where I lived, someone had copied my apartment key, and the only place that still felt calm belonged to a man I had known for less than 48 hours. Adrian dismissed his security director with a quiet nod before looking back at me. "You should remain here tonight," he said. This time I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the library once more. The shelves filled with books. The carefully restored paintings. The warm light from the fireplace. Mrs. Eleanor humming softly somewhere down the hallway while preparing tea. Nothing about the house matched the image I had carried in my mind after hearing whispered rumors at charity events. "If I stay," I said carefully, "it is because I am making that choice. Not because anyone made it for me." Adrian inclined his head. "That distinction matters. It matters to me. Then it matters to me as well." For the first time since we had met, I felt something inside me begin to settle. Not trust. Not yet. But certainty that he meant exactly what he said. Later that evening, Mrs. Eleanor showed me to a guest room overlooking the gardens. The room was elegant without feeling extravagant. Cream-colored walls reflected the fading sunset. A quilt rested neatly across the bed beside a stack of classic novels on the nightstand. Fresh lilies filled the room with a faint, clean fragrance. There were no locked doors. No guards outside. Only quiet. I unpacked the few belongings I had carried from school and noticed my restoration notebook peeking from my backpack. Without thinking, I opened it and began sketching the cracked surface of an old landscape painting I had been studying in class. Drawing had always slowed my thoughts. After several peaceful minutes, a soft knock interrupted the silence. Adrian stood outside holding a flat wooden case. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded. He placed the case carefully on the desk before stepping back. "I thought you might find this interesting." Inside rested a small 19th century landscape painting. Time had darkened the varnish, and tiny fractures stretched delicately across the painted sky. Despite its age, the composition remained beautiful. "This is original," I whispered. "Hudson River School." Adrian smiled faintly. "My grandmother intended to restore it herself. She never had the chance." I carefully examined the edges without touching the painted surface. "It can be saved." "I thought you might say that." He watched me study the artwork with quiet curiosity. "You forgot everything else while looking at it." I laughed softly. "Occupational hazard." "No." His voice remained calm. "Purpose." I looked up from the painting. "You really notice everything, do not you?" "I try to notice what matters." We stood there in comfortable silence until I finally asked the question that had stayed with me since the gala. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked toward the painting instead. "Because years ago someone ignored a warning they believed was too small to matter." His expression grew distant for only a moment. "The consequences lasted a lifetime." Before I could ask what had happened, his phone vibrated. He read the message, and the thoughtful expression disappeared. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "the board of the Metropolitan Heritage Museum is holding a private meeting." I frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Adrian met my eyes. "The two men you overheard at the gala will both be attending, and for the first time, I believe they are not interested in museum funding at all. I believe the charity gala was only the beginning of something much larger." I barely slept that night. Dawn arrived quietly, washing the gardens in pale gold while dew settled across the hedges like scattered glass. Standing beside the guest room window with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I realized how strange it felt to wake somewhere that should have seemed unfamiliar, yet somehow felt safer than my own apartment. By 7:30, I found Adrian already seated in the breakfast room, reading several newspapers spread neatly across the table. Fresh fruit, toasted sourdough, and scrambled eggs sat untouched beside his coffee. He looked up as I entered. "Good morning, Claire. Did you sleep?" I asked. A faint smile crossed his face. "Enough." Mrs. Eleanor appeared carrying another plate. "Sit before your coffee gets cold," she insisted warmly. For a few peaceful minutes, breakfast felt surprisingly ordinary. She asked about my classes. I asked about the roses blooming outside the dining room windows. Adrian listened more than he spoke, occasionally answering questions about the estate or the history of the old house. If someone had walked in without knowing our circumstances, they might have mistaken us for family friends sharing a quiet morning. That illusion ended when Adrian's security director entered carrying a sealed folder. He placed it beside Adrian without speaking. Adrian opened it, scanning the documents with the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. Then he slid one photograph across the table toward me. I froze the moment I recognized the face. "Professor Daniel Whitmore," I whispered. He had taught advanced restoration techniques at Columbia for nearly 15 years. Every student respected him. He had encouraged my scholarship application during my second year and had written one of my recommendation letters. "Why is his picture here?" Adrian folded his hands carefully. "Because he attended the same private meeting last month as the two men you overheard at the gala." I shook my head immediately. "There has to be some mistake." Adrian did not argue. "I hope there is." He handed me another document. It listed donations made to several museum preservation projects. Professor Whitmore's signature appeared beside approval forms authorizing access to restricted archives. Nothing looked suspicious until I noticed one detail. Every approval matched the dates Adrian's investigators had been quietly monitoring unusual financial activity surrounding historical collections. "He studies Renaissance paintings," I said. "Why would he be connected to museum finances?" Adrian answered softly. "Because someone needed access that only respected experts could provide." I looked down at the papers again, refusing to believe what they suggested. Professor Whitmore had spent years teaching students to preserve history, not exploit it. He had celebrated every successful restoration as though each painting belonged to humanity rather than a collector. "I cannot accept this," I admitted. "Neither can I," Adrian replied. "That is why I asked my team to verify everything 3 separate times." Silence settled across the breakfast room. Outside, birds continued singing as though the world had not quietly shifted beneath my feet once again. Finally I looked up. "What happens today?" Adrian closed the folder. "Today we attend the museum meeting." I blinked in surprise. "We? You were invited 6 weeks ago." I frowned. "No, I was not." He reached into the folder and removed a cream-colored envelope addressed to Claire Bennett. It carried the Metropolitan Heritage Museum seal and my full university information. "The invitation was mailed to your apartment 4 days ago." My heartbeat quickened. I had never seen it before. Adrian looked directly into my eyes. "Someone intercepted your mail before you ever knew the invitation existed, and I believe they were trying very hard to make certain you never walked through those museum doors." We arrived at the Metropolitan Heritage Museum just before 10 o'clock. Morning sunlight reflected across the limestone facade, making the historic building appear timeless against the glass towers surrounding it. I had visited the museum dozens of times as a student, always entering through the public galleries with a notebook tucked beneath my arm. Today I walked through a private entrance beside Adrian Romano, wearing the same navy blazer I had borrowed from Mrs. Eleanor that morning. It fit almost perfectly, though I still felt like an ordinary student who had accidentally wandered into the wrong room. The executive conference hall overlooked the sculpture garden through towering windows that flooded the space with natural light. Museum trustees, donors, curators, and preservation specialists greeted one another with polite smiles over coffee and folders filled with meeting agendas. Professor Daniel Whitmore stood near a marble column discussing restoration funding with several board members. When he noticed me, genuine surprise crossed his face. "Claire," he said warmly. "I wondered why you never responded to the invitation." I looked at him carefully. "I never received one." His smile faded slightly. "That is impossible. I personally requested that your name be added because of your conservation research." Before either of us could continue, another trustee approached him with a question, and the conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. Adrian quietly observed everything without interrupting. "You believe him," he said after Professor Whitmore walked away. I nodded. "Yes." Adrian glanced across the room. "So do I." The meeting began a few minutes later. Reports covered restoration grants, educational outreach, and the acquisition of several private collections scheduled for public exhibition. Nothing sounded unusual until the chairman introduced the final agenda item. "Our anonymous donor has agreed to finance the complete restoration of the Ashcroft collection." Several trustees applauded politely. A large presentation screen illuminated behind the podium, displaying images of 19th-century paintings waiting to be conserved. I immediately recognized one canvas. My breath caught before I even realized why. It was the unfinished landscape Adrian had shown me the previous evening, the painting his grandmother had intended to restore herself. I turned toward him in confusion. He remained perfectly still. "That painting belongs to your family," I whispered. "It did," he answered quietly. "It disappeared from private storage nearly 20 years ago." My eyes returned to the presentation. The museum records identified the work as part of an anonymous donation with no documented ownership history before the previous decade. Something was terribly wrong. Professor Whitmore slowly stood from his seat. "Excuse me," he interrupted respectfully. "There appears to be an error in the provenance documentation." Several board members looked surprised. He adjusted his glasses before continuing. "These ownership records were altered. They do not match the certified archive I reviewed last month." The room grew silent. Trustees began comparing printed documents while curators exchanged confused glances. The chairman frowned at the screen. "Are you certain, Professor?" "Completely." His voice remained calm. "Someone replaced the original files after my review." Adrian leaned toward me just enough that only I could hear him. "This is why they wanted you away from the museum." I looked at him. "Me? You study restoration." He nodded toward the projected painting. "You would have recognized the conservation marks beneath the varnish. They reveal the authentic ownership history." My heart raced as I examined the enlarged image again. There it was. A tiny restoration signature hidden along the lower edge of the frame, almost invisible beneath layers of aged finish. I had seen the exact technique in Adrian's library only the night before. The room erupted into urgent discussion, not with panic but with determined professionals demanding immediate verification of every archive connected to the collection. Professor Whitmore turned toward me across the conference table, his expression suddenly filled with realization. Then he spoke words that changed everything. "Claire," he said clearly enough for the entire boardroom to hear, "you are the only person here who examined the original restoration method yesterday. We need your professional opinion before anyone makes another decision." Every conversation in the boardroom faded into the background as dozens of eyes turned toward me. For a brief moment I forgot where I was. I was no longer the waitress carrying silver trays beneath glittering chandeliers. I was no longer the frightened student holding an anonymous note in a tiny apartment. I was exactly who I had spent years becoming. An art restoration student who understood that history often whispered instead of shouted. I stood slowly and walked toward the projection screen. The enlarged image of the landscape filled the wall in remarkable detail. I asked for the digital magnification controls, and the museum technician handed them to me without hesitation. The room became perfectly still as I zoomed into the lower right corner of the painting. Beneath layers of aged varnish rested an almost invisible restoration signature formed by tiny brushstrokes instead of ink. "There," I said quietly. "That marking was created during conservation, not during the original painting process. It is a restoration fingerprint." Several curators leaned forward. Professor Whitmore smiled with unmistakable pride. "Can it identify the conservator?" one trustee asked. I nodded. "Yes. Every master restorer develops habits that are nearly impossible to copy. The placement, pigment mixture, and brush angle all become part of an artistic signature. This technique belongs to the same conservator who restored the painting Mr. Romano showed me yesterday." Adrian remained silent, allowing the experts to continue. Within minutes, the museum archivists compared historical records with preserved restoration photographs stored in their digital archives. One after another, discrepancies surfaced. Ownership documents had been rearranged. Catalog numbers had been reassigned. Donation timelines no longer matched authenticated restoration reports. None of the discoveries required raised voices. The truth simply revealed itself through careful observation. The chairman finally closed the presentation folder and looked around the room. "The acquisition process is suspended immediately pending a complete review." Every board member agreed without objection. Professor Whitmore turned toward Adrian. "Mr. Romano, I believe your family's documentation deserves formal reconsideration." Adrian inclined his head politely. "I appreciate your commitment to accuracy. The paintings matter more than ownership." The chairman smiled. "Perhaps that is exactly why they should be returned to the proper history." As the meeting concluded, sunlight poured through the tall museum windows, illuminating the sculpture garden beyond. I stepped outside onto the stone terrace, letting the cool spring breeze settle my thoughts. Adrian joined me a few moments later, standing beside the fountain without speaking. After everything that had happened, the silence felt familiar instead of uncomfortable. "You knew I could recognize the restoration marks," I said. "I suspected you could. You trusted me before I trusted myself." He looked toward the museum entrance where students carrying sketchbooks were beginning their afternoon tours. "Sometimes people need someone else to recognize their purpose before they can fully see it themselves." I smiled softly. "My ordinary life is never going back to the way it was, is it?" Adrian considered the question before answering. "No." He looked at me with the same calm gray eyes that had first found me across the ballroom days earlier. But ordinary was never the same thing as meaningful. A year later, I walked through another charity gala wearing a simple midnight blue dress instead of a waitress uniform. I had accepted a full-time position with the Metropolitan Heritage Museum after graduating, leading restoration work on paintings that had almost been forgotten. Across the ballroom, I saw Adrian speaking quietly with museum donors whose scholarships now funded young conservators across New York. When our eyes met, neither of us hurried to cross the room. We simply smiled, remembering how everything had begun with a broken crystal glass and a single unexpected conversation. "I once believed the brightest lights belonged to the richest people. I know better now. The brightest light belongs to those who quietly protect what others are willing to overlook, because true power is never measured by the room that falls silent when you arrive. It is measured by the lives that become stronger because you chose to stay."